So Clark's the provincial weed specialist with Saskatchewan Agriculture in Regina, and he's going to look at how herbicides break down and how dry conditions can impact certain herbicides. So I will pass it over to Clark.
Okay, thank you very much. What we're going to be looking at as far as herbicide carryover is something that comes with us with the dry cycles. And so essentially where we started really twigging into this was in the early 2000s, and this is a field near the Yorkton area where the portion of the field on the left was seeded the previous year to something like a flax that had a group 1 graminicide product and say a Buckshall or MCPA or something like that with no residual component to it. But the field on the left, it was split, and so that was a wheat field, had Everest on the right-hand side. And so we end up with this line down through the middle of the field, and we've got pale peas on the right-hand side, and we've got normal peas on the left-hand side. You go in closer and you start looking at these things, and you can see you've got reduced size leaves. They're turning more of a white color, and that seems to be a characteristic of the Everest compound versus other sulfonylureas that might turn it yellow. But anyway, we saw this in the fields and started thinking, okay, well, why are we having this problem? And we came across um, moisture as being the limiting factor. And so we started looking at, well, what's the risk of carryover that we wouldn't expect, and trying to evaluate that as well. So essentially what we're worried about is our crop effect coming into the next year, right? So there's a lot of things that go into how that crop is going to respond. And first off, it's your herbicide that was applied last year, or depending on the herbicide and depending on the carryover restrictions on it, it could have a 2 or 3 year restriction for a particular crop. So it could be a herbicide that was applied in 2019 or 20 as well. So that's something to kind of keep notice of in your in-field records. It's also dependent on the rotational crop sensitivity. So if your residual product can be used in that crop, it's unlikely it's going to be causing any injury problems for that following year. But if it's a crop that is very sensitive to that active ingredient, then you're going to have higher risk of injury. It also depends on the herbicide breakdown rate. And so there's some herbicides that, like one of the products called AIM or carfentrazone, it's got what's called a half-life, or how long it takes to break down half of that product, that is a day. And so it doesn't last very long, but there's other products that break down over many, many months and sometimes years. So we have to look at that with respect to our herbicides that we've used the previous years. The other thing that comes into play is soil organic matter and buffering, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but it impacts not only um, the herbicide breakdown rate, but also it can affect how your crop responds the following year as well. Soil pH impacts herbicide breakdown, particularly for certain herbicides that break down through hydrolysis, and we'll talk about that in a bit. And it also affects buffering in some way. So all of this stuff happens under normal circumstances, and so this is the thing that companies have to figure out about their product just right out of the gate. And so they have to have kind of these guidelines right in place. But what'll happen is that sometimes weather is not conducive to normal breakdown. And so then we start getting unexpected things happening. And so the weather in 2022 can affect how that crop responds to the herbicide in the soil. The weather from previous years impacts how that herbicide breaks down. Other stresses come along and make that crop less healthy potentially and less able to cope with the residues in the soil. So there's lots of things that are this is a very complex web, and the whole point is because it's so complex, it's very hard to pin down exactly what a person's risk is with respect to carryover in the soil. So we'll talk about the one on the right. There's two main pathways of ways that herbicides can break down, and the one on the right is called chemical hydrolysis. And essentially, you've got a water molecule, which is that H2O, comes in, hits the middle of that molecule, splits it in half, and so each of those halves that were part of the original molecule are not as herbicidally active as the original molecule was. And in some cases, maybe they are, but then we have further breakdown that occurs in that case. Um, all of these breakdown products are all considered when PMRA is assessing um, what the potential environmental impact of that herbicide is. And so while they may not necessarily be herbicidally active, they might be active to biology in other forms. So that's why they have to kind of take those things into account. This kind of process is particularly important for the group 2 sulfonylurea class, and only some of the products in that class are broken down through this pathway. The other one is group 5s, or things like atrazine are broken down through hydrolysis primarily. And there'll be a hydrolysis component to some of the other products as well. The one good way to kind of pick up on this is, well, if there's a restriction on how long to leave this thing sitting in your spray tank, there's likely a hydrolysis breakdown component because it can't stay in water very long before it degrades. And so that's a good cue to something that breaks down through hydrolysis. The major breakdown pathway, though, is through microbial degradation. And essentially what happens is that these microbes use the components of these herbicides. So if you look at the elements on the right-hand side there, it uses the carbons, which are the C's, for energy. It uses the S and N for the building of proteins and things in the microbes cells. And so they'll just chew off those things bit by bit and break down that herbicide so that it's not herbicidally active anymore. The picture that we have here is of Chromobacter, and that's the microbe that's associated with breakdown of glyphosate in the soil. I talked about binding in the past, and essentially there's two key components in the soil that contribute to binding, and binding can be a bit of a double-edged sword because it can essentially what happens is that if you have a herbicide, it will bind to that soil. Particularly the more polar that your herbicide is, so the more charged that your herbicide molecule is, the more likely it is to stick to that soil element. So the clay or organic matter, which are negatively charged. And so it can be two things. So when it gets applied to the soil, it can stick to that soil if you've got a really strongly charged herbicide, and that can kind of minimize the amount of breakdown that occurs because all the breakdown occurs in the water component of the soil rather than on the solid component. But the other advantage to that is that in the year where you're growing your crop, that buffering capacity also prevents a big flush of that herbicide that your crop might be sensitive to from flushing into that soil water where the root is growing, and um, protect it from the effects of that herbicide in the soil. And so that graphic that we've got on the right hand side there, the brown bits would be the solid portions of the soil. So you've got the clay and organic matter and silt and sand and things like that. Those are all the solid bits, and don't on their own have any particular um, ability to support a living organism per se. All those living organisms are going to be in the blue part, which is in the water film that forms around those particles in the soil. And if everything was blue in there, that would be a bad thing as well, because then that would be a saturated soil condition. And so most of the microbes that we have that break down herbicide are aerobic microbes. And so, except for one particular exception with group 3 herbicides that break down under anaerobic conditions really fast, we want air particles in that soil, and saturated soil conditions can cause that herbicide to not break down as well. We've also got photodegradation and volatilization as minor breakdown elements. Photodegradation is just simply the sun shining down on the product as it sits on the plant leaf or on the surface of the soil. Um, and volatilization is just if you've got something that turns into a vapor, that vapor will gas off into the atmosphere and be lost from the soil. These are really minor breakdown pathways once you get a herbicide into the soil. So let's zoom into what's going on right up close on those soil particles and where the water is up against them. Um, this would the model we've got here is, again, the brown bits are the solid portions of the soil. The blue is the water portion of the soil. I haven't got the air portion in there, just for argument's sake. And then the orange bits are the herbicide molecules, let's say. And so with a relatively non-polar herbicide, this is kind of what you would get, is you get roughly equal portions of that herbicide existing in both the water and on the solid portion of the soil. So this might be just very lightly charged. And so it's not an absolute, so it's not like you're going to get herbicide molecules A, B, and D stuck to the soil and C, E, and F out in the water. Those things are changing as time goes on, and so it's kind of like a magnet in some degree that if you take one of the pins off that gets stuck, and you've got a whole bunch of pins on the table, not all of them are going to get stuck to that magnet. So you pull one off and it's got a little more energy to pull another pin up to that magnet. Uh, this is an example of a very polar molecule, something like glyphosate that is very strongly bound to soil. And so what that does, again, to illustrate the balance, is that when our little friend, the microbe, comes along and starts consuming that herbicide in the water, as that consumption goes on and it gets reduced in the water, it always tries to maintain that proportion of how much is in the soil or stuck to the soil and how much is retained in the water portion of the soil. With a persistent, then at the end of the year, hopefully all of our herbicide is gone and we've got a happy microbe and everybody's cool. What we get with a persistent herbicide is that it takes longer, and so winter comes along, and so it starts getting cold and our microbes start slowing down and not consuming things anymore. And then when winter really sets in, no herbicide breakdown happens whatsoever. And this is a good example of how that takes place is, again, DT50 on the uh, bottom axis of this chart is how long it takes for 50% of what you've applied to the soil to break down. And so after one half-life for DT50, you've got 50% left. After 2, you've got 25% left. After 3 of those periods pass, you've got 12.5%, and so on and so on. So it breaks down in kind of a elliptical curve as it starts from 100% and works its way down. So what you can see here is that the green bar is nice warm soils, and so that would be what you might consider to be the normal DT50 for a particular herbicide. 2,4-D is going to be very short, and so if you make things cold, it impacts it, yes, relative to what your regular breakdown rate is, but compared to the other herbicides in that list there, It's not very short even in under cold, or it's not very long even under cold conditions. So it breaks down pretty readily. But some of these other products that we have in this list that can be considered residual to some degree, depending on when they get applied in the year, um, you can kind of get an idea of who's breaking down by microbial activity and who's breaking down largely by my hydrolysis. Where you've got a lower impact of cold conditions, you've likely got a higher proportion of breakdown occurring through hydrolysis. So with thioncarbazone and metsulfuron, you've got a fairly significant hydrolysis component to the breakdown of those products. Whereas with things like pyrosulfatol and tribenuron, you're looking at a really big extension of the breakdown under cooler conditions. And so that's a good indicator that you're relying on microbes. And microbial activity will vary as the temperature varies. So when we get low on moisture in the soil, essentially we run out of space for our little microbe friend to operate. But what we may get under some circumstances is some hydrolytic breakdown occurring if our soil moisture is kind of not super dry. Where you've got severe drought, it drives those herbicide molecules very strongly onto the solid soil partition, and no breakdown takes place. So what we did in 2018 is look at our risk map for 2018 and plot some of the cases that we got at our crop protection lab to find out, well, is our map really telling us anything, or is it just a bunch of hokum? I've been producing these maps since the early 2000s when we had those original drought periods. And so just wanted to see, is this really working the way we want it to work? And so we get a good idea that the breakdown that's taking place with things like Viper and Aries and Odyssey, the IMI, the Pulse IMI products, largely where we're having carryover issues that are longer than expected are in these sort of red and orange zones here that are less than 125 millimeters, and hence some of the new recommendations on those products from BASF. But if we look at some of these other active ingredients that can be persistent as well, things like Everest, the flucarbazone in that, in the clopyrrolid and curtail M, and the pyrosulfatol that's in Infinity and other products, you can see that they need a little bit more moisture in order to break down properly. And so they can be persistent even upwards of 6 inches of rainfall through that June, July, and August period. So these are the maps that we produce in Saskatchewan, and you can kind of do the same thing with the maps that are produced by the um, uh, Drought Watch folks. And so the one on the left is for Drought Watch, and so um, we've been doing these maps on the right-hand side there for, as I say, since the early 2000s. And we're pretty confident that it's representing what our risk is. Manitoba started doing maps similar to these that are reflecting very similar breakdowns as we are, as far as how much rain on our maps in similar colors. And so we've got that going, but Alberta really doesn't have a very similar map. So you pretty much have to rely on the Ag Canada Drought Watch maps. So there's a question with the dry conditions and land blowing, is that breaking chemicals down faster or just transferring it to another field causing trouble that way? If land is blowing, if it's dry, there is no breakdown taking place. And if the land is blowing and the herbicide is bound to that soil, it will move with the soil that's moving. So I hope that that's answering the question. So it is, in theory, wherever that soil is going, it's taking the herbicide with it. And by and large, your herbicide residues are all contained within a very shallow layer of the soil. And so that's going to be the first one to blow when you get those high velocity winds. Okay, so let's look a little bit closer at the Alberta situation. Um, I've included my scale on the right-hand side there for the maps that we produce, just as an example, and the color codes are a little bit different. And then the drought watch legend is up at the top there, over top of the map. And so essentially, what we've got uh, going on is that um, where you've got the light green and into the yellow and brown, that's where you're starting to get increased risk of herbicide carryover for the following year. And the line between the green and the yellow is that 125 millimeter line on the updated BASF recommendations. Um, Down in this deep brown area, down in the southeast of the province, this is very severe breakdown uh, restrictions. So you're probably not getting a whole lot in the way of breakdown taking place when you're downwards in that 45 to 65 millimeters of rainfall from June, July, and August. Essentially, is the time frame that we're doing this. The other thing to kind of keep in mind is what's happened in the previous years. And so this area of Alberta and southern Saskatchewan is something that is a little bit of a concern going back in time. So we've got insufficient moisture for breakdown, not only this past year, but from the year before, and the year before that, and the year before that. So there could be residues hanging around down in the south part of the province for several years. And essentially, if you have a year that's insufficient for breakdown, you essentially have to add a year to the recropping recommendations for that herbicide. So how does this affect my crop in 2022? There's a high risk of unexpected herbicide carryover in many areas of Alberta for 2022, particularly on the east side of the province. The west side, a lot of areas got more moisture, and so they may not be as bad off. Most of the rainfall that I saw in a way was restricted to either early June or mid-August within that June, July, and August period. And so as a result, you're you've got really poor conditions for breakdown. Those little light showers that occur in between and you've got really dry soil really don't attribute a whole lot to breakdown. So you could probably, when you're measuring moisture during that time frame, knock off anything that's a tenth of an inch or less, because essentially it gets absorbed into the soil and that soil is dry again within a half an hour from that rainfall. So there was little showers really don't help a lot as far as breakdown goes. So essentially, follow crop choices after residual products are going to have to be very conservative in 2022. And so essentially, when I talk about recropping options, that's the ones that are actually labeled. So within that group of products that are labeled, you need to choose the very most tolerant, and the herbicide companies will know what those are. So consult with the manufacturer of that herbicide, and potentially an herbicide going back into 2020 or 2019 to determine safest crop options. So how bad is herbicide carryover and how can I find out? Well, the companies may not have had a lot of experience with poor climatic conditions, especially some of the new herbicides that we've had on the market. So by and large, companies are pretty good about, once they find out that they have challenges with dry conditions, they're pretty quick to update their labels and get some kind of restriction put on there for the crops that may be the most sensitive. Um, but some of the newer products may not have had as much experience in dry conditions in Western Canada to know what's going on. If we look at an example of an updated label that we've got coming from BASF going into the 2022 season, um, if we look at what their normal recropping is for Mazamox as standalones, that would be things like Solo, but it could also extend to, so it'd be for Solo, Viper, and Adrenaline, but it could also extend to the other products that have standalone Amazamox in them. So things like Davai and Next and Benz and Image. So the green is able to recrop 1 year after under normal conditions. So you've got a whole spate of products that can be grown there, and then they've got tame mustard is delayed until the second season after application. So with the new restrictions that they've added to the Mazamox label, essentially where you've received less than 125 millimeters of rainfall during June, July, and August, or in the brown soil zone, you've had less than 15 millimeters in any one of those months, regardless of what your total accumulation was in those 3 months. Then you have to delay your planting of canary seed, non-clearfoot canola, flax, tame oat, and clearfoot, non-clearfield wheat, durum wheat, or winter wheat. So essentially, if you're planning on putting winter wheat in the fall, you have to wait until the following fall to put that winter wheat in. And then durum wheat is restricted to not the next year, but the year after as a result of the dry conditions. And if you've had in the situation with tame mustard where there's already a 2-year restriction on it, if you've had poor rainfall conditions or those drought conditions either in the year of application or the year after, you also have to add another year to that. So it could be either of those 2 years and you'd have to add an additional year. Now, if you've had both years with those conditions, I'm not sure if that means you add another year again to those kinds of crops that have additional restrictions. So for the Mazamox and Mazathiper products, which are Odyssey or other products like Judo, there's a bunch of them out there. Again, the 1 year after crops are Field P. They're all listed there. That they really they haven't changed a lot except for canary seed, and I didn't mark it well here. Durum wheat has been pushed back with Odyssey under normal conditions to year 2. So that's something to kind of keep in mind now, is that that's a major change to the label. So again, if you're looking at that less than 125 millimeters during June, July, and August, or you've got less than 15 millimeters in any one of those months, regardless of accumulated rainfall, you want to add another year to oats. And with non-clear field canola, same kind of thing occurs as with the tame mustard with the standalone Amazamox. If you've got that poor rainfall condition in either the year of application or the next year, then you have to push non-clear field canola back another year. So herbicide residue detection systems, there's been a few looked at. The old standby is the field bioassay that's listed on the label. Then it's got some challenges because it doesn't really tell you what you can do this year. It can tell you what you can do the year after this year. It's always important to have left the check strip, and with the really accurate single nozzle precision application systems that we have now, we really don't have, and GPS, we don't really have those overlaps in the field that we used to have back in the good old days, so to speak, that we could kind of go to and look and say, okay, well, here's what normal is and here's what injured looks like. So really that process is not particularly practical way to do things. The other thing is that you're running a strip of this thing through your field, and so you really have to take it to harvest. So you're losing that part of the field as well. A chemical analysis through sort of a standard chemical testing lab, where they run the stuff through a machine and tell you absolutely how much stuff is in there. Those systems have gotten very, very good and very, very accurate, and down to very, very low amounts they can find in the soil. They tend to be costly, so if you know what herbicide you're looking for, you're talking about potentially in the $300 per sample uh, cost level. If you don't know and they have to do a full screen, you're looking upwards into $2,500 to $3,000 to get your single sample assessed. Um, and in some cases, group twos can be, even now, can be active at lower than the level of detection for some of these systems. And so that kind of creates a problem. But the big problem is that it doesn't take into account that buffering capacity of your soil. So they can take that stuff, they can run it through the machine, they can give you an absolute number and say, okay, this is absolutely how much stuff you've got in your soil, but nobody can tell you with any certainty what that number means. Below a certain part, the company can probably say, yep, less than that, we know for a fact you're not going to have a problem. Or at another level, a higher level over that, we can tell you how much, but there's a big no man's land there in the middle where nobody can tell you what that means. And so you still got risk there. So we've got our soil bioassays that can be done in lab over the winter. And essentially what you're doing is you're taking your soil and you're pulling that out of the field and you're sending it off to the lab. They grow it, put it in pots, and they grow the crop that you're interested in those pots. It's similar in cost to that chemical analysis per sample. And yeah, you can get results in 2.5 to 6 weeks, depending on the crop. Sometimes it can be more sensitive than the chemical analysis for those low use rate products. Unfortunately, because of the cost of infrastructure and the infrequency of use of these services, nobody offers this service anymore. Uh, the the station up in Vegreville used to do it, but they haven't offered it for several years now. There was a company out of Ontario that was offering it for a bit, but they no longer offer it. And it's largely because you've got that cost sitting there doing nothing while the conditions are good. The other thing that kind of enters into this is that there's a fairly high risk of false negative, where somebody does this process and you get a result back and it says, yep, everything's good to go. But then you put your crop in the field and the crop ends up getting injured. And so that's the risk of a false negative. That's fairly high with this. And so that risk is also something that influences companies to maybe not get involved with it so much. The University of Saskatchewan has developed a different kind of lab bioassay, uses less soil, so that's nice. It's done in these little, looks like hanging file envelopes essentially, that are only maybe about a centimeter wide. And the lab is a little bit quicker than that lab bioassay, because essentially what they do is they grow it in soil for 7 days and then they make an assessment after that 7 day period. And essentially the assessment is measuring the root length. Um, to date, this hasn't been adopted by any labs from a commercial perspective. There was some interest that was expressed when I did this presentation locally here in Saskatchewan, and so they contacted me. I connected them with Dr. Shano out of the soils group here at the University of Saskatchewan, and so fingers crossed, maybe we have a test that's going to be coming out of that. Again, false negative, a little bit kind of dodgy, but if you're not putting a whole lot of investment into it, then it may be bearable. So this is kind of result that you get. So the normal root there is on the left-hand side, and you can see as your level of herbicide goes up in your soil, you're getting a shorter and shorter root. In some cases, what they have to do is look for symptomology at the top um, to be able to tell, but generally that root length is the way to look at it. Okay, so if you've got a problem where somebody is suggesting that there may be residue causing injury to the crop, what are the symptoms that you need to be looking for? So when we look for group twos, so those would be your sulfonylureas, IMIs, SACTs, so the flucarbazones and varos of the world, or the TZP, so those are the Corteva group twos, like Simplicity and their fluoroacylam products. Essentially, you'd be looking for symptoms like this, where with grasses, you're looking at intervenoclerosis, and what you'll see is that the early growth or the tip of that leaf will be healthy, but the base of that leaf, once you have a rainfall event and the material gets down into the rooting zone, that's where you'll end up getting the rooting symptom or the injury symptoms starting. And because grass leaves grow from the bottom and push old material up, that's where you'll see the injury symptom first, is right down near the base of the leaf or the new leaves that are growing out of the growing point. The other thing you can see is stunted tillers, reduced leaf size, and shortened root lengths as well, and that kind of feeds into that bioassay option that they have. This is another example of what you'll see with group 2 injury on cereal crops. And the one leaf there that is normal is that one on the right-hand side. That's what the normal leaf would look like. But then as you get more and more exposure to those newer leaves, what you're seeing is a change in the proportion of leaf blade to leaf sheath. So you'll have a longer leaf sheath and a shorter leaf blade. And that's where your stunting kind of comes into play. You may also get a proliferation of tillers taking place as well. So you'll get more tillers being formed than you would expect to be normal under the conditions that you have. What you get in a broadleaf plant is a loss of apical dominance first. And essentially what happens with broadleaf plants is that growing point at the top of the plant is the controller of all the branches that could be produced down through the length of that stem. And when you take away the dominance of that growing point, essentially you end up having branches break loose and being produced down at the bottom of that plant. And so when you have group 2, generally, if let's say if you had a deer come along and nip off the top of the plant, what happens is that the next growing point down will take over and take over control of the plant. But in the case of group 2 injury, all the growing points have lost any dominance, and so as a result, you get a proliferation of branching from the bottom of the plant. And in some cases, you can even get it triggering increased disease issues. This is an example of a pea plant that was impacted about halfway up that picture. And it was growing along nicely. Well, I wouldn't say nicely because it was pretty dry. And then they got a big whopper of rain, and within about 7 to 10 days, the symptoms started showing up. And the symptoms in this case are shortened internode length. So as you get towards the top of the plant, the distance between leaves gets shorter and shorter and shorter until they're just about insignificant right near the growing point. The other thing that you'll note about this plant is that as you go to and look in the crotches of the leaves all the way down the plant, there'll be growth starting to initiate from each of those crotches all up and down the plant. And again, that's that loss of apical dominance on that plant. Group 3s, those really don't move around in the plant. It's essentially the tissues that are going through that treated layer of the group 3 herbicide in the soil. are the things that get affected. And essentially what we see is with that middle plant there is you get clubbed roots. So the tip of the root will be thicker and shortened compared to the rest of the root. You'll get a lack of root hairs being observed on those roots as well. And the plant on the left there even has a shortened and fattened um, um, polyoptil as well. So you can get if that polyoptil goes through that treated layer, you're going to get symptomology showing up there as well. Group fours. Generally, when we think of group fours, we think of edge with shallow seeded barley. I'm not sure if that's a question or a statement. So if you can clarify that, then I can answer it. Okay, the group 4 symptoms, the thing we think of as the key symptom for that is leaf cupping, stem twisting, things like that. Um, it's so it's that's kind of the decorative component where the business side of the group 4 is going on is what we see in the left hand side of this picture here is it creates a whole bunch of undifferentiated cell growth, and as a result it cuts the top of the plant off from the bottom of the plant. And so when we get that undifferentiated cell growth, we can get that portion of the stem or root splitting open from the pressure of those cells in that case. It doesn't mean that those other symptoms are unimportant, but from the perspective of the way the herbicide works, that's kind of the business end of the herbicide. Okay, what would deep-seeded barley look like? Barley is more tolerant to things like edge and trephlan, so less likely to be impacted, but from the perspective of other grasses, let's say, um, if you, it's kind of, finding the sweet spot, so to speak. You want it deep enough to be below the treated layer, but you don't want it so deep that it causes stress on the plant, because as soon as you get more stress on the plant, you will get more as it's trying to push towards the surface, you'll make that plant more susceptible to that group 3 carryover. Group 5 and 7, these are both they're membrane disruptor herbicides, and so essentially when they get to a toxic level, they cause disruption of the cell membranes in the tissues that they're present in, and that causes the guts of the cells to spill out into the environment and causing that tissue to dry out and desiccate. And so these compounds are also only upwardly mobile in the plant. They're not downward mobile. So if you get it into the soil, it will move upward in the plant and it will concentrate up in the tip of that leaf. And that's why you end up with grasses. You'll get the leaf tip dying back because they accumulate up there until they get to a toxic level, and then they have their membrane disruption effect. With broadleaf plants, it's kind of similar in that, again, if you've got sublethal doses that don't cause that really brown condition right away, what you end up with is you'll get them moving it to the up in the plant to the outside of the leaf, and they'll start by causing a halo condition. They'll start with yellowing, and then they'll progress to necrosis and cause that leaf to kind of die back from the edges as it concentrates that stuff in the edge of the leaves. Group 13 is a bleaching compound. And again, as we talked about with the group 2s, if you really haven't had much of a rain to trigger the release of these things into the rooting zone, you get relatively normal growth. And so you can see on the right-hand side there, the tips of the leaves were green, and then you get a rain and all of a sudden that gets liberated into the rooting zone, and the roots pick that stuff up, and any new tissues that are being formed are formed without chlorophyll or any other pigments. And so you end up with that white bleach material that is down at the bottom of the leaf of the grass plant. And the other thing to note is that you do get these little purple flecks in there. And again, that's just anthocyanins building up within the plant because it's under stress. Um, this stuff is going to be fairly particular about the soils that you'll see that injury showing up in, and in the left-hand side, you can see it's very soil specific, where you've got a little bit of a stream kind of running through here, and then it kind of branches out where the soils are similar. And not very much injury out here in the areas where the soil is a little bit maybe heavier clay or organic matter in those soils there. Group 14s, they can have very similar symptoms to the group 5s and group 7s, in that they can get that sort of peripheral injury pattern on broadleaf plants. Typically, they're mostly active on broadleaf plants and not very active on grass plants. The other thing that you can get is if it's coming up from the soil in a toxic amount. And essentially what happens is that these things get activated in light. So if they get moved up in the plant and all of a sudden get into the veins of the leaves, then it can activate it right away as soon as it's in the veins of the leaves. And so you'll end up with venochlorosis as well. And so that's illustrated in this picture here, where the center of the leaf is necrotic and the outsides are fine. And so that all that is just essentially related to the dose that that leaf is, or that plant is getting coming up out of the soil. So if it's a relatively light dose and has to accumulate, you may see injury on the outside edge. Whereas if you have a fairly high dose and it's moving up very quickly in the plant and then activating right away, then you're getting that the burning on the inside of the leaf. Group 15s, and just keep in mind that there has been a bit of a change with um, trilate and EPCAM getting moved from a group 8 to group 15 now. The international body that looks at herbicides and decides what group they sit in made that change here over the winter. And so now trilate is also considered to be a group 15 herbicide. Because it's essentially the way that it impacts the plant is very similar to the other group 15s. So the symptomology that you'll see with grass plants is on that left-hand picture. You'll have a plant that turns sort of a deep dark green color, almost bluish, and it just stops and sits there and really doesn't do anything. Whereas that more normal plant on the right-hand side is a brighter, lighter green color. The other thing that you'll get with grass plants is that oftentimes the tips of the leaf will get stuck in the sheath of the leaf before it. And so as a result, you'll end up with a bit of a hook or loop taking place here on these leaves as they come out. The other thing is this leaf on the left-hand side of the center picture there, you'll get a symptom called onion leafing, where that leaf rolls in on itself on a longitudinal axis. And so it looks essentially like an onion leaf, hence the name. With broadleaf plants, you'll get something called a drawstring effect. And it looks like somebody's threaded a needle and thread down through the main vein of the leaf and then tugged on it from the bottom. And so it crinkles back that tip of that leaf, and you get an indent in the tip of the leaf and some crinkling on the tips as well. You probably with some of the older group 15s, you'll probably see that with things like pigweed, and this is a stinkweed that's in this picture. Group 27, the one to focus on is the picture on the right, the pea plant on the right there. And essentially, again, this is a pea plant that was growing along quite happily, even under relatively dry conditions. And then all of a sudden, again, about a third of the way up the plant there, all of a sudden it rained. And essentially, in this case, all the the leaf tissue that is sort of below that lower third of the picture was already had its pigments already formed. And then the further you get up the plant, again, this is an upwardly mobile compound, so it accumulates at the edges of the leaves. And this is a good example of that halo effect I was talking about with the group 5s and 7s and group 14s. A little bit different symptom though. The symptom here is just bleaching. You just don't have any color in those leaves. And so the further you get up the plant after the exposure, and the newer that the leaves get, the less and less pigment they have in them. And so the brand new leaves right at the very top of the plant have no pigment whatsoever. The lentil plant on the left-hand side there, the curling in there is not the symptom to do with the pyrosulfatol that's in the infinity. The paling of the color is, but what it did do is it did highlight the injury that was existing in the field from the producer that put pursuit on prior to seeding his lentils. And so that cupping and curling and narrowing of the leaflets, that's all to do with the pursuit injury. The pyrosulfatol injury just highlighted that the pursuit injury was there in the field. It was in the plants that were outside of the treated area with the pyrosulfatol because it was a demo strip. It was really easy to go from one to the other and see the different injuries. Sometimes non-herbicide injury can be kind of fingered in a case where somebody thinks there might be herbicide carryover. The most common thing that we see is people think that drought is herbicide carryover. And the way to tell drought from herbicide carryover is that in the case of both broadleaves and grassy plants, it'll start sloughing off the older leaves or the leaves closer to the bottom of the plant. It'll start dropping those off because those are a source of loss of water, and they're not contributing as much to the growth of the plant anymore. Oftentimes what you'll see is the leaves will be more oriented upward rather than nice out flat, trying to collect as much sun as possible. And so when they orient those leaves upward, they're trying to protect themselves from the heat of the day. Leaves are typically a bit smaller, um, but not really otherwise distorted. Sometimes they start rolling in on themselves as well. Um, and you often get that sort of bluish color on the leaves as the leaves start accumulating more wax on the outside of the leaf to try and prevent moisture loss that way. So, to sum things up, the major routes of degradations are primarily microbes and also hydrolysis, and both of these require moist soil, warm temperatures, and with persistent herbicides, time. And so, if they run out of any of those, you'll end up with situations where you could have herbicide carryover. Soil moisture levels are below normal for a good chunk of the province, or well below normal the east half. Sorry, this is the Saskatchewan perspective. Um, Soils can vary in their pH and organic matter, and that has an impact on buffering capacity and potentially breakdown in the case of those herbicides that break down through hydrolysis. I wouldn't really waste money on a traditional chemical lab assay to find out how much stuff is in the soil, because it really doesn't help you determine whether you've got any risk or not, because of that clay and organic matter in the soil. Lab bioassays are more available, but as we said, nobody does them anymore, and we're kind of in the point where we don't know what's going to happen to that new uh, assay. And so essentially what this means is that producers in much of the province need to be very conservative about their recropping options going into 2022. And we have another question here. Would you expect any residual injury from fall applied herbicides like Valterra, 2,4-D, and Fierce? Well, Valterra and Fierce are essentially the same thing because they both have flumioxazin in them. The only difference is that with the Fierce you also have peroxysulfone in there as well. 2,4-D, really short-lived. We had most areas I think had some fall showers. And so I think in those situations, I don't think you would expect any worse residue out of 2,4-D than you would expect normally. I don't know that I would go planting something really sensitive like canola afterwards. But you shouldn't have any issues with by and large most of the pulse crops if you've had rain there. Um, Valterra and Fierce, sorry, I presume if you put those on in the fall that you're planting a crop the following year that is registered for use with those products. And with that, in that case, I would say no, you shouldn't expect um, any concern with injury with those registered products. But if you're talking about Valterra and Fierce that were put on in the fall previous to the year that you grew the pulse crop, and now we're not talking about this past fall, but the fall before. Um, Again, those are one of those new ones that we don't know a lot about. Um, they're not. I don't think they're particularly long lived in the soil. They really only provide about 2 to 4 weeks worth of control. So and they're going to be able to take advantage of some of that early moisture in the year as well, and late moisture in the fall to try and break down a little bit. There is a hydrolysis component to the flumioxazin in that um, if you get there's a pH effect as well, is that if you're in very high pH soils, you get quicker breakdown than you would in acid soils. So those are all elements that kind of fit into that as well. And that's kind of my time. Thought is new rules on seeding non-clear filled wheat on viper stubble. Uh, um, Non-clear field wheat, if it's spring wheat and you're seeding on viper stubble, is still okay. It's durum that's the issue now, where when you've had dry conditions. So that's a thing to kind of think about. Uh, if you put winter wheat on viper stubble this fall, then yes, that could be a concern.
Okay, are there any final questions for Clark? All right, hearing and seeing none. Clark, thank you so much for your time, and the other presenters for their time today. We are wrapping up our morning session. We'll